Now, what else that's more concrete that's come out of this? The U.S. Government would stress, of course, the value of the reset, not surprisingly. But from the U.S. point of view, and not just in the administration, there are, I think, several tangible benefits that have come from it. One has been more, that's harder to pin down because it's under veils of secrecy. There has been better, by all accounts, better cooperation in a variety of counterterrorism issues. This is done mostly through intelligence, so it's hard to pin down precisely what it consists of, but American spokesmen are pretty clear that they're happier now than they were before about this. There have also been, of course, some things in the area of non-proliferation and arms control. One is a set of initiatives that the U.S. supported by Russia for an international fuel bank. There's the New START treaty, et cetera. I'm not going to pay too much attention to these, not because they're not important, but because I think you could make an argument that these were so much in Russia's interest that they were not directly, at least primarily a product of the reset. But there are a couple of other areas that are important where it's easier to make the case that the reset really helped. And those have to do with Iran and Afghanistan. In the case of Iran, what I'm referring to is the Russian agreement to support a new sanctions resolution, a joint proposal concerning nuclear fuel supply arrangement with Iran, which was rejected by Iran but seen as constructive. The withdrawal of a previous agreement to sell advanced air defense systems and so on. Second, in Afghanistan, again, Emmons has referred to these transit arrangements through the Northern Distribution Network are not trivial. This has been helpful, and if you talk to any American military planner, they will tell you this has made a difference. So now the U.S. government will also point to other things, increased military contacts, private meetings, and so on. But it seems to me, from a political point of view, these two, Iran and Afghanistan, are at sort of the top of the U.S. list. And they're not. A couple of observations about them. One is they're not trivial. They do bear on central security concerns and preoccupations in Washington. They are areas where Russia has been more forthcoming. There are areas that the U.S. cares about and have helped. The second observation is that although they're not trivial, they also haven't transformed anything. That is, they haven't transformed the issues themselves. It hasn't solved Iran, it hasn't solved Afghanistan, so for reasons I'll mention in a moment. In many ways, I think the harder issues, including the harder questions that will engage Russia in both of those areas, are yet to come. And they haven't transformed the bilateral relationship. They have improved it, but there's still a lot of distrust on both sides, which affect and a lot of wariness about what to commit. And this has affected still U.S.-Russian relations in a whole series of areas. I'll come back to it. And finally, the third observation is, when you look at this list, you have to notice that these issues by and large, don't much relate to European security. They're really about things elsewhere. And I mention this because what has driven, I think, the center, the core of the reset is a set of security issues which are primarily outside of Europe. It's also important to note that although there's been a lot of effort to try to expand and complicate the relationship with economic issues and energy issues and so on, it is still the case that the center of the U.S.-Russian relationship focuses very much on a fairly limited number of more or less hardcore security issues. In that sense, the U.S.-Russian bilateral relationship is very different from the European-Russian relationship, which has a lot more dimensions to it, at least a lot more important dimensions than ours does. So, as I say, if it's the case that a lot of what's driving the reset is not about Europe, what are the implications for Europe itself? Let me just, in particular for this region, let me just very quickly highlight a couple of cases, a couple of issues which I think are very much worth discussing and unresolved. There are a lot of others that I'm not going to talk about, but these are a couple that seems to me that where some decisions are going to hit people's agendas pretty soon. One set of issues has to do with the nature of the U.S. And NATO U.S. defense engagement in this region in particular, and related questions about Article 5. Now, the good news, as Imans has said, is that the U.S. has engaged, that there has been some improvement in the past year. As I mentioned before, a lot of this has been driven by the Street of Concept exercises, that the defense and deterrence review in NATO to follow, planning exercises and the like. Secondly, a second issue, and this is referred to it as CFE. The U.S. has proposed this parallel action program to try to get out of the paralysis we're now in. I don't see many people who are very confident that this is going to work. That is, the conditions that the U.S. and NATO attach to this are completely opposite from the ones that Russia does. And the issue is going to be whether or not whether or not CFE and the resumption of some kinds, at least of transparency arrangements, are sufficiently important to put Georgia issues to the side. This is clearly what Russia was on to do. It's going to be a problem for NATO, and there are, it's a complicated argument, but I think that's another big issue to come. A third looming issue, which will clearly affect this part of the world, has to do with so-called substrategic, non-strategic nuclear weapons. The U.S. is clear, the administration will push hard for negotiations. I can tell you I'm in some groups where I'm dealing with the Russians. Their enthusiasm is containable for this. This is going to, what they basically say is two things. One, you remove all your weapons, then maybe we'll talk. That's one part of it. The second is, well, tell us that we're going to make progress on missile defense, conventional strategic weapons, and space, and then maybe we can talk about non-strategic nuclear weapons in Europe. I think that this is going to be a difficult issue. Obviously, it's very much closely related to questions of what is a sensible nuclear policy, how does it relate to the credibility of Article 5 and the like. Fourth big issue is missile defense, also been raised. Again, I'm also involved in some meetings with the Russians. There are discussions with the Russians going on at several different levels, at governmental levels, bilaterally between the U.S. and Russia, of course at NATO, and then a whole array of them at non-governmental levels, so-called Track 2 and Track 1.5, and I'm involved in some of those. What I can tell you is, what I'm convinced is that they're, put it very crudely, there's sort of two groups of people in Russia now. There's a group of people who want to engage on missile defense so that it will fail. There's another group of people who want to engage in missile defense so that it will succeed. It's hard to, I don't myself have a very good sense of what the relative weight of these two groups is, but I would just point out that one thing they share is a view that, for better or worse, this issue is going to can have an absolutely transformative effect on U.S.-Russia relations and Russian-NATO relations, for better or worse. I do think that there's some prospects for, I think both sides politically at the government level are committed to making this work, but it's going to be very hard. I do expect some kind of framework agreement this summer. I wouldn't be surprised, at least, if it comes. But underneath this, all the hard issues I think are going to get deferred. And I just say 2 points about it because they have to do with with what we can expect. One is that underneath all this are very different threat perceptions. The Russian view, unlike the American view, the Russian view, by and large, is that there is no imminent threat, nuclear missile threat from North Korea or Iran. That the trends there, they will acknowledge, are worrisome, that they bear watching, but they don't generally see a need, at least not yet, for an elaborate missile defense system to deal with it. What that means is that when they engage, as they are, on missile defense, they're not engaging because they want it as a way of dealing with Iran. They're engaging because they want to influence U.S. and NATO programs. They want to, as I say, they want a piece of this action. They want to be able to influence the design of it. They want to influence. They want a piece of the decision making and so on. And the hard things are can we accommodate anything that we have. The key underlying issue here is the basic architecture of the system and the related command and control arrangements. The Russians talk a lot about buttons, that they want their own button, or 2 buttons. Well, first of all, there's not going to be a button. I mean, you know, this has got to be a metaphor, because given the times involved, what we're talking about is basically a computer algorithm which is going to look at missile defense warning, at this, you know, what the sensors are telling it, and there'll be a program which will decide whether this is the sort of thing which ought to be shot at or not. Now there'll probably be some kind of command center which will say yes or no, but it's not like there's going to be some political decision. These things are not going to go back to, you know, Brussels, Washington, and Moscow and say, should we, you know, convene the Security Council and decide. It's not going to work that way. This is a metaphor. When they talk about buttons, I think this has got, they must understand this too. This is a metaphor for control and access. And this is, you know, in technical terms, this is not that hard to work out. What they'll accept, I think, is a much more complicated question. It's pretty clear what they won't accept, but not so clear yet what they will. The last issue, and I'll stop with that, has to do with the NATO-Russian relationship more broadly. For all, you know, occasional talk about it, membership is not on the table, NATO's not interested, and frankly, Russia's not interested, at least not this Russia. But the question is how, you know, are there ways to improve the relationship that are useful both politically and in substantive terms? The emphasis now is on concrete cooperation through a reinvigorated NATO-Russia Council. The history of that has been mixed. Some parts of it have worked quite well, some less so. Missile defense clearly is I think, probably the single big issue there, but there are many others that over time, the hope is at least will create a more solid constituency in Russia for a reasonable relationship with NATO. We'll see. If you believe, as I do, that NATO should remain the core security institution in Europe and the core of transatlantic relations, security relations in Europe, then that question of giving Russia, you know, how do you give Russia, how do you prevent Russia from being a destructive revisionist power centers on its relationship with NATO, and it seems to be over the longer term that's the big issue to discuss.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. And now for the